All right, here's the homework video for 8.1, finding the domain and the zeros. So like I said in class, remember we're going to focus on what's inside the square root. So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out where the square root equals 0. So I set my what's inside the square root equal to 0. I factor, I come up with my two zeros, and then what I'm making a sign pattern of is what's inside the square root. I'm not making a sign pattern of the function, I'm making a sign pattern of the square root. Wherever my sign pattern is positive is in my domain. So for my domain, I'm from -3 to 3 with brackets because it's okay to have 0 inside a square root. And then I can write my 0 as plus or minus 3, comma 0. Number 3 is not factorable when you set what's inside the square root equal to 0. So go ahead and use your polynomial solver or your graph to come up with the zeros. Again, we are not making a sign pattern of the square root, we're making a sign pattern of what's inside the square root. And anywhere that is positive on that sign pattern of what's inside the square root is going to create our domain. So -∞ to -1.449 in a bracket, because 0 is okay inside the square root, in union with 3.449 on to infinity. And then of course I list my two zeros. Number 5, although the two zeros are integers, you're not expected to be able to factor this, so you plug what's inside the square root into your calculator, either using the polynomial solver or the graph. I come up with these two zeros. Since I only got two zeros, one of them is going to need to be a double root. In other words, my sign won't change, and that happens to be the 1. The only place my function is positive, the function inside the square root is positive, is after 3, but I need to include the 1 because it's okay to have 0 inside a square root in union with 3 to infinity. And then of course I list my two zeros. And then finally number 7. Number 7 is factorable by grouping. So this is a situation where if I was going to put this on the test, I would put it on the non-calculator part, but if it was on the calculator part, you'd be welcome to use your calculator. Remember, we don't have a sum of squares, so I'm not going to get a 0 from x squared plus 1. So the only 0 I have is at 9. And remember, I'm using the function inside the square root to make my sign pattern. This is not a sign pattern of the square root. The only place this function is positive is before 9. So I have my domain, -9 to -∞ to 9. I have my 0. Now, in problems like 13, we still need to find our zeros. In other words, we need to find when the numerator equals 0, but we also need to find our vertical asymptotes. Our vertical asymptotes are going to break up our domain, okay? So I find my vertical asymptotes from setting my denominator equal to 0. Make my sign pattern. Again, this is a sign pattern of the function inside the square root. It is not a sign pattern of the square root. I look for where my sign pattern is positive. Be careful, vertical asymptotes will always have parentheses around them. Zeros of the square root will always have a bracket. So my domain, -2 with a parentheses to 0 with a bracket in union with 2 to infinity. And then of course, don't forget to include your zeros. Don't forget to label your vertical asymptotes using X. 15, again, if I want to know my zeros, I set my numerator equal to 0. If I want to know my vertical asymptotes, I set my denominator equal to 0. Again, this is a sign pattern of what's inside the square root. I find my signs, recognizing that the zeros will use brackets, the vertical asymptotes will use parentheses, and I'm able to come up with my domain, zeros, and vertical asymptotes. Now, multiple choice 1 is going to require us to overlap sign patterns and see where they're both positive. We can only have this function g of u when the domain of square root of u overlaps with the domain of root 9 minus u. So I find my 0 of root u, I find my 0 of root 9 minus u. I set up my sign patterns, and the only place they overlap as both being positive is between 0 and 9, so choice D. Now, multiple choice 2 is a little tricky because it's actually asking us to find the sign pattern of the entire function, when up until now all we've done is look at the sign pattern of what's inside the square root. Since nothing exists before -3 or between 3 and 4, I shouldn't have any signs. My graph is entirely beneath the x-axis, so my sign pattern would be negative. Choice C. Again, I hope this helps. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask questions in class, and we'll keep working on the material. Have a good day.